Good afternoon and welcome back everyone from a quick lunch, a slow service. The topic of my presentation is value incongruence or misfit, and it's specifically in the form of positive and negative outcomes of incongruence or misfit in the form of OCB and CWB. My presentation is, or the study is actually a very good example of the theme, and which talks about the outcomes of misfit. To begin, when we, I need to get used to this. So when we talk about either fit or congruence, the first thing that usually comes to mind is values-based fit or values-based congruence. There is a lot that has been studied, a lot has been researched about congruence, but when it comes to incongruence, as we saw this morning and as we all are aware of, there is not much on incongruence or the misfit side in this field. But in our opinion, it goes hand in hand. Where there is fit, there is also misfit. Where there's congruence, there's also incongruence. I'm not going to talk much about this, but this is the introduction that we all are very much aware of. The objective of my study, as we saw earlier, was highlighting the positive and the negative outcomes of misfit or incongruence. How it began was, again, it was the outcomes are OCB and CWB, organizational citizenship behavior and counterproductive behavior. The idea initially was to look at the effects of incongruence or misfit in the form of something positive, which is citizenship behavior, something negative, which is counterproductive work behavior. And as we developed the study, we realized that we can go a level deeper, a level further. So we have the positive outcome, which is citizenship behavior, but even that can have a positive or a negative perspective to it. So high OCB would be positive, desirable, to be encouraged, but lower levels of OCB can be a negative outcome of incongruence. And about counterproductive work behavior, the first thing that comes to mind when you think about misfit or incongruence and counterproductive behavior, lesser the better, right? So can incongruence also lead to lower counterproductive behavior, which would be a positive consequence or something desirable? Okay, and how do we propose to do this? This is, you see there are 4 quadrants. There's the two incongruence quadrants and 2 congruence quadrants. The congruence quadrants are not part of today's discussion, but then we are going to look at quadrant 1, which is where the individual is high on a certain value, but the organization scores low, and the other, that is quadrant 3, which is the individual is low, but the organization scores high on a certain value. This has also been known as deficiency and excess. So excess would be where would be quadrant 3, where the organization is higher, and deficiency is the first quadrant, where the organization scores lower on a certain value compared to the individual. And to help place this in terms of the most commonly used method for analysis in PO fit literature is the surface plot, the 3D surface plot from the study of Edwards, Cable and Edwards. That's the perfect or the ideal fit image. So we have the 4 quadrants. Okay, now we bring in the outcomes, so OCB and CWB. The hypotheses are split outcome-wise. First, we talk about OCB. So the theme, the general objective or the general idea is to understand whether incongruence or misfit, does it always have to be negative? It's more probably a language concern that when we hear misfit, when we hear incongruence, we expect that it's something negative and we don't want too much of it. So does it always have to be negative is the underlying idea, but we are also going to look at the positive aspect. So the first hypothesis, again, just another point, we are using the Schwartz values. There are 8 of them, and 5 of them are here: stimulation, achievement, conformity, self-direction, and security. The other 3 values come in the second hypothesis. So the idea here is higher OCB, which is the positive aspect of this incongruent relationship. So when the individual is high and the organization is low, compared to when the individual is low and the organization is high. So it would be a comparison. We expect that the first quadrant on the left-hand side top is where OCB will be higher compared to the third quadrant at the bottom for these values. The second hypothesis is OCB will be low for these values. Again, it's benevolence, universalism, and hedonism. We have split it according to the values. So for these three values, when the individual is low, so it's quadrant 3, when the P low, O high combination, OCB will also be lower. That was the OCB hypothesis. Now we come to the counterproductive behavior. Again, here CWB will be higher, so the negative, the undesirable, the avoidable part of the hypothesis of the model. Counterproductive behavior will be higher when the individual scores higher than the organization on these four values, that is stimulation, achievement, universalism, and self-direction, than when the individual scores lower. So that's higher CWB in the first quadrant compared to the third quadrant. And for the remaining values, the remaining four, so for security, benevolence, hedonism, and conformity, we expect that counterproductivity will be lower when the organization scores higher than the individual. So again, in that's quadrant 3, there will be lower CWB compared to quadrant 1. Okay, we had 480 respondents. It's based on Schwartz values. The 8 values are here. The items were translated into Dutch, and the other information is not that crucial. Okay. The analysis part of it, polynomial regression analysis, and although this is more from the congruence perspective, we say ideal fit or ideal congruence, what we expect for incongruence will be along the incongruence line. So you can see from the left to the right, it's the incongruence line, and from the front to the back is the congruence line. So what we expect is probably something rotated more to your left, but essentially a similar kind of a bird or kite. And what did we get? This is what we have, no birds. But then, I'm sorry, the figures have been switched. So I'll talk about H1 first, the security one. So what we expected is what we found, only for the value of security. So how do we now interpret this? OCB is high, so what we want, something desirable, something positive. OCB is high indeed when the individual is higher on the value or the individual values security more than the organization does. And hypothesis 2 was when that OCB will be lower, the negative or the avoidable part of the model, that OCB will be lower when the individual is lower and the organization is high on the value of universalism. For counterproductive work behavior, this was hypothesis 3, which was not satisfied, was not supported, but then it is interesting. What we expected was for the values of stimulation and achievement, we expected that when the individual is high and the organization is low, the counterproductivity will be higher. But what we found was the opposite. For these, so the P high O low combination, we found that counterproductivity was indeed lower than expected. And for the values of security and hedonism, it was supported, it was in line with what we expected. Counterproductivity was low, which is good when the individual is low and the organization is high, scores high. And for this, for the fourth hypothesis, which was for conformity, again, it was not supported. So what we were expecting was when the individual is low and the organization is high on conformity, we were expecting lower counterproductivity, but we found the opposite. That is, we found higher counterproductivity. Okay, so what we looked at was the incongruence. What is incongruence? It's about which one is high, the interaction between the individual and the organization in terms of which one is high and which one is low. So we broke it down into 2 quadrants, actually 4, but then just 2 incongruence quadrants. And it makes a difference whether the individual is high or low, specifically when you keep in mind the outcome variable. And yes, incongruence can be positive. So when counterproductivity is low, that's a good thing, that's a positive thing. When OCB is high, that's also a positive consequences. In addition to the obvious negative results of the mismatch between the individual and the organization. So when we look at the OCB relationships again, like I said, at some point we expected OCB to be high, but it turned out to be low, or when we expected it to be low, it was high. So what are the possible explanations? It's more, OCB seems to be more individual driven. It's the individual's or the employee's motivation or the person's motives that if there is no gain, if they see nothing to gain from the organization, there's no real motivation to go above and beyond your job, no motivation really for the proactive behaviors. And there is also something from the social exchange theory, which says there is those individuals with a low exchange orientation or a weak exchange orientation generally do not reciprocate or do not say thank you to the organization by showing more OCB. So for those who have a high exchange orientation, they do go above and beyond their jobs and display OCB. And there's also something about the self-serving motive, so the good actor or the good soldier motive. So self-serving, if there is something for me to gain, yes, then I do indulge in OCB, I do more than what is necessary. So that could be for the reasons for the OCB incongruence results of the relationship. For CWB, again, in general, counterproductive behavior is seen as a coping tactic, or it's a retaliation to deal with the pressure or the stress that you are put under. Especially when the individual is low, the organization is high. It can be an emotional response, it can be a mood regulation tactic. So especially those who are aggressive individuals, they see that the organization is pushing them, maybe even to the point of coercion, to be achievement oriented or success oriented, whereas they are not in the first place to begin with. So then what do? They indulge in counterproductivity as an emotional response, as a stress, to deal with the stress, or as a mood regulation tactic. If they are depressed, if they are bored, if they are unhappy, then they use counterproductivity perhaps as a mood regulation tactic. To conclude, we're looking beyond common assumptions that incongruence is necessarily negative, and although it's not part of this study, but we also looked at the congruence models, and congruence need not be positive all the time, and this is where Schneider's ASA comes into place. So the homogeneity and the heterogeneity hypothesis. So when there is a homogeneous employee group, it need not be positive always. Some heterogeneity is good, is desirable. It's different, the study is different. We have included OCB and CWB as part of the fit or congruence context. Counterproductivity and congruence, or even incongruence for that matter, is not a very commonly studied topic, so there's something new there. And yes, the weaknesses, it's a concurrent nature, an employee sample, so possible inflation of effect sizes, and we have used generalized OCB and CWB measures. So it's one OCB score, one counterproductivity score. Maybe at the facet level or at a narrower specific level, we have better results, or more interesting results. And indeed, there are two sides to the coin. So if we talk about incongruence or misfit, it can be positive, it can be negative. So the two sides go hand in hand, cannot really separate them. And that's it. Thank you.